Hello, my zebras and spoonies. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me today. I am glad that you are here. Today I'm going to be talking about boundaries. It's something that I talk about a lot because I think that it is super important. So, what are boundaries? Let's start with the basics. Setting boundaries is about listening to yourself and your inner voice and drawing social lines where you're made uncomfortable. So everyone's boundaries are different, and that's really super important because that necessitates that we, as mature, responsible adults, need to communicate with each other about where our boundaries are. We can never assume that other people know what our boundaries are or that we know what other people's boundaries are because everyone is different and their comfort zones are different. We all have things that could trigger past traumas or trigger sensory issues or just whatever. We all have different things that make us feel uncomfortable or unsafe in our lives. And those are the areas in our social interactions that we need to draw boundaries around. So, setting boundaries is an act of self respect and an act of self preservation. It is the most essential act of self care. When someone does something to you that makes you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, it comes with a mental health cost. It uses spoons that are very essential in our lives, and we can't afford to be wasting spoons on stupid stuff that we just shouldn't be wasting them on. So, boundaries can help us with this by saying to someone, hey, this is my boundary, and then holding to that. The thing about boundaries is that you need to be respectful. You need to say, when you do this, it makes me feel this, and therefore I would like you to not do that. And open up a dialogue of maybe how you can meet in the middle and how you can negotiate a compromise. I mean, clearly there are some things that boundaries need to be black and white on, like hitting people. That's a boundary that everybody should have that should be black and white. But the majority of the things in our lives, like when you yell, even if you're excited and happy, um, you know, can have variability and flexibility and compromise and discussion about it. So if yelling is something that makes you feel anxious and upset, you can you can say to someone, when you yell, it makes me feel really anxious and upset, and I would prefer that we use quieter voices. And the compromise comes in that if this space can't be quiet, then you can find and negotiate another space to decrease the stimulus so that you can feel okay. That's setting a boundary, and that's okay. And respectful people are going to either try to make a quieter environment or facilitate you having a place so that you can go and get that quiet space that you need. Having boundaries doesn't mean that you don't respect other people or that you aren't grateful for having their relationship. It means that you're expecting that relationship to go two ways. It means that you expect this person to honor your needs for a sense of safety and security in your life because that's a basic human need. And we have the right to protect ourselves and make sure that we feel safe, even if it doesn't make sense to someone else, even if that isn't a trigger of feeling unsafe for someone else. That doesn't matter. If it makes you feel uncomfortable and unsafe, then it's worthy of a social boundary for you. And boundaries are really important for a lot of reasons. And first of all, it's because it creates a sense of safety and comfort in your space, which is an essential human need. We need to feel safe in order to work on other things in our lives. That's the first piece. But the other piece is that boundaries help us understand each other and help us be respectful with each other, and it helps us engage in this social dance because everyone's needs are not the same. And if we don't draw boundaries clearly with each other, then we're inevitably going to be crossing over people's boundaries because we don't see them and we aren't aware of them. And we don't do it out of disrespect or hate, but because we have boundary blindness. So it's necessary that these boundaries are communicated and drawn. Sometimes drawing boundaries can create social conflict, and sometimes it's because people don't understand why. I mean, I have misophonia, and sometimes sounds are really uncomfortable for me, and I have to remove myself from the stimulus because it's physically painful for me to be present when there's certain sounds. And people who don't have this sensory issue often look at me perplexedly and don't understand the problem. And it's okay that they don't understand. They don't need to understand because you don't need to understand in order to be respectful of a boundary. You don't need to share someone's experience, and you don't need to fully understand someone's experience to be able to respect that this is something someone needs. So someone's boundaries being expressed can also create conflict if you've not been drawing boundaries in your relationships and now you're starting to. This change raises questions and confusion because you're changing the dynamic of a relationship, and that's difficult. So oftentimes that pushback isn't about the boundary itself, but it's about the change of the dynamic and the change of the pattern and the confusion that comes with that. And we don't need to change our boundaries. We need to address that issue. And sometimes we just need to have conversations and say, hey, I've been working on me. And lately I feel like one of the things that I need to do is draw better boundaries in my social relationships. Just put that on the table there where other people can see it. And there's nothing wrong with being open and upfront about that. And if people are not willing to respect your boundaries and they just repeatedly push back over and over and over again, and they ridicule you for having boundaries and are super disrespectful about your boundaries. And I don't mean just questioning, like, why is that a thing? I mean, like, really being hateful about it. I would want you to question if this person should be a part of your life. Do you want people in your life that don't care if you're feeling unsafe and uncomfortable in the environment in which you are residing? Think about that again. Do you want people in your life that don't care if you are feeling unsafe and uncomfortable in the environment in which you are residing? Do you want people in your life who do not care about your sense of personal safety? Because disrespecting your boundaries is a disregard of your sense of personal safety. So I'm just going to leave you with that thought, and it's something to consider. So it's absolutely essential to understand that love equals respect. It doesn't matter what type of relationship that we're talking about. If it's going to be a good, healthy relationship, it's going to be one that is founded upon and centers around mutual respect. That means that both people's needs matter equally and that both parties are going to work for both people's needs to be met at all times. And that doesn't mean that there's going to be times that one person triggers the other, and it doesn't mean that sometimes one person has bigger needs than the other, and that's just going to be times that one person needs more support than the other. That dynamic is just going to shift back and forth, and that's okay. It really comes down to respect, and respect is about boundaries and having our boundaries respected in our relationships. I think that one of the things that is misunderstood about boundaries is that people often avoid setting boundary because they don't want to have conflict with others. When the reality is that setting boundaries actually we decrease the amount of conflict that we have with others because it sets clear expectations in your relationship. And when the people in your lives will know what's expected of them, and then they will know how to best be respectful and how to support you. When things are left unsaid and when things are left gray, people just kind of guess and muddle through and hope it goes out well. And really, inevitably, this is just going to lead to people crossing each other's boundaries without realizing that's what they've done. And then it leads to a lot of conflict. And often conflict that goes unaddressed, where one person will cross the boundary of another person, and then you'll have this frustration and anger response. And the person who did the boundary crossing might not even know what's going on, and they're really not sure how to talk to it about them, and there's a state of anger, but you haven't set this boundary before. So how do you tell them, hey dude, don't do this, you were wrong? Well, they weren't wrong because you never said don't do it. So it gets complicated and messy. When you set boundaries, we draw very clear lines and we make our relationships easier to navigate with each other. So while it can be uncomfortable to have these conversations, drawing boundaries with each other will actually lead to reduced conflicts overall in our relationships. So don't avoid drawing boundaries for the purposes of reducing conflicts because it's just not going to work. Drawing boundaries can help eliminate feelings of resentment because we're going to avoid the unintentional boundary crossing and these everyday repeated slights that are going unaddressed. By having these conversations with each other, we're going to address the feelings and that anger so that you don't get to the point where you're resentful and then really terribly, if that resentment is allowed to go on, it will cook up and eventually lead to hate. So we just don't want any of that. Setting boundaries really does promote closeness in our relationships. It allows people to feel safe and comfortable in their relationships, which allows people to open up and be more vulnerable, which allows for that sense of closeness. But if we don't have a sense of safety, then we're not going to be willing to take the risk of vulnerability. So if you want to be close with somebody, boundaries are super helpful in achieving that sense of safety that invites vulnerability. So we've talked about boundaries a lot, but it's kind of this vague idea. So what are boundaries? What do they look like? What do you do with them? Boundaries are for all types of relationships. Whether they're your spouse, whether you're dating, whether they're your parent, your child, friendship, doesn't matter. Boundaries exist in all relationships. And all types of relationships are built off of mutual respect. And mutual respect is built very well when both parties are expressing where their boundaries are and having discussion about what makes them feel safe and comfortable in that type of relationship. And some things to know about relationships that I think that we kind of already know, but we don't generally talk about, is that different types of relationships are going to have different types of boundaries. You're going to have a different type of boundary with a spouse than you're going to have with the child, and that then you're going to have with your sibling, or that you're going to have with a friend. All of those boundaries are going to look different, and that's okay. That's normal. It's completely normal and acceptable for boundaries to change over time. I mean, if you consider your child at 5 versus 25, your boundaries and your relationship with that child is going to be different because, in context, they're still your child, but they're not a child. They're an adult. So your boundaries with this individual are absolutely going to change over the course of that 25-year relationship. But this is also true over the course of a marriage, or over the course of years with your siblings, over the course of years where friendship boundaries change, because we as humans change over time. So our boundaries are just going to. Sometimes boundaries surprise us. We don't know that something's going to upset us or going to make us feel uncomfortable and safe until we experience it. And that's okay too. We just need to then put on the brakes and say, whoa, I don't feel comfortable with this. I don't feel okay. And that's setting that boundary. And that's a safe, appropriate, and good way to handle the surprise. There's always going to be the first time you experience a thing. And now that you know that this thing is a problem, you just need to communicate that. So there are different types of boundaries. There are physical boundaries, and this is who gets to hug you, who gets to sit next to you, and also when do you show physical affection? Is that a public thing or is that just private? Do you have to ask for permission every time, or can they make it more of a quiet request? There's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions. It's about what you as an individual are comfortable and safe with. And you just need to make these rules clear with the people that are in our lives. So physical boundaries are definitely one very clear place that we all need to set boundaries. And I think that one boundary that needs to exist in all relationships is that you should never have physical violence in any relationship. So that one physical boundary that should just always be there. Another type of boundary is having emotional boundaries. And this is where you will talk about the way that you feel and know how you engage and show your feelings with other people. So if you're feeling guilty, ashamed, upset, or undervalued, this is a problem. And it's probably a time where boundaries are going to be needed in that relationship. It's the time that something's going on where you're being encroached upon, that you're being asked to do things that you don't feel like you should be, or you don't feel like things are fair. So when you're feeling these emotions, pause and consider where these emotions are coming from, because sometimes these are emotions are self-generated. Sometimes we feel guilt because of the baggage that we carry around from our past. And the same thing with shame and anger, self-esteem issues. It really isn't good. We carry way too much baggage. Sometimes stuff is things that we just have to work through. And we just need to talk about it and say, hey, this is my trigger. And we don't necessarily need a boundary, but it might be something that we need a boundary for a while to work through. Could be a boundary that you need right now, but then in a year or two, you've worked through it and it's not a boundary that you need anymore. Yay, good job for working through the stuff. So emotional boundaries are what we're comfortable with and how people talk to you, how they engage with you. If you have a disagreement, is it okay to yell? Is it okay to name call? Is it okay to throw things? I would say no to all these personally. I'm a huge advocate for deferred violence being bad, but we're getting into some gray area here, and there's wiggle room as to where this might not be abusive behavior, but just be careful. Make sure you have good boundaries. There are things with emotional boundaries like, are you comfortable with surprises? Because this is one of my emotional boundaries that I've found that my family often didn't respect when I was a kid. I'm a planner and I need to prepare for events. I have a real difficult time switching from one task to another. Transitions are difficult for me. So when you surprise me with something, it demands that I immediately make a transition. And that's really hard and it's very stressful and anxiety provoking, even if whatever you're surprising me with is a really good thing. And even if what you're surprising me with is a very simple thing, like say, I'm working on a blog and you come and you ask me a nursing question, I'm going to grind intellectual gears while I shift over to change tasks. It's just part of how my brain works. So I have this boundary of don't plan to surprise birthday parties for me. Don't surprise me with presents. Don't do the whole surprise thing. I'm not comfortable with those things. Another type of boundary is related to our sexuality. So we need to be clear about our expectations around physical intimacy and whether or not we are talking about a spouse, somebody we are dating, or someone we're having a casual relationship with. It just doesn't matter. We still need to have very clear boundaries and make our expectations clear and need to make sure that whoever our potential partners are know what we consider to be safe. And some boundaries that we could set could be around like frequency expectations, sexual conversation or comments. Is it okay to talk about sex, like in general conversation? Or is it okay to have sexual touch? All of these things are things that need to be drawn as your boundaries and your lines. And even going further, as far as if there are things that are off limits, like many of us have things that we just like, nope, I won't go there. And that's okay. We should make those boundaries of hard nopes clear to our partners so that they know about that. You should be clear in where our boundaries are and what our comfort zone is. And this is especially important if you have any kind of trauma history. We have boundaries around intellect. So, this is really about ideas and belief and showing respect for differences in views and ideas. When you're in a relationship, you're not always going to have the same political views. You're not always going to agree on social events. I mean, right now with COVID being what it is, there's a lot of debate about everything and whether or not you should wear masks or take the COVID vaccine and social distancing, blah blah blah. I mean, whew, you're bound to have friends who are on the opposite side of the opinion that you are, and boundaries is how do you respect this person that you care about who has a difference of opinion? And how do you have respectful conversations with each other? When people have different views and ideas than you do, because you can have different political stances, different religions, all of those things, and still have good, healthy relationships. Because we can still have respect, even if you don't share all the same ideas and beliefs, because it's about respect. And sometimes that just means that it isn't a thing that we're going to talk about. Intellectual boundaries are super important because everybody's entitled to their own ideas, opinions, and beliefs. Also, along with this, is that we should be treating with respect regardless of what their intellectual capacity is. It shouldn't matter what your IQ is. You shouldn't be treating somebody as if they have less value because they have less IQ than you. And this is also part of intellectual boundaries and respect. So the other big boundary that I would like to talk about is financial boundaries. In a marriage, that'll be like, are you sharing accounts or having separate accounts? How are you spending your money? Who's paying what bills? What's going into savings? What bills do you pay? What do you save? But financial boundaries exist between siblings and friends and with your children. Do you loan money to friends? There's no right or wrong answer here. Again, it's just a boundary issue. Same thing with your family. It's just important for you to know what you're comfortable with and what works for you and to make those expectations clear. So, yeah, boundaries are about a lot of different things. Um, I think that one of the last things that I kind of want to talk about is medical boundaries, because this comes up for us a lot in regards to decision making. If you're a legal adult who has guardianship of yourself, then you have decision making power of all of your medical stuff, and you don't need anyone else's input, permission, opinion, consent, agreement, etc. in any of the decisions that you make in regards to your health. Now, you always have the right to include other people in your decision-making process, but it's important for you to remember that it's a choice that you make and that there's no one in your life who is entitled to be a part of your medical decision-making. That is always exclusively yours, and absolutely you should be drawing boundaries when people in your life try to make decisions for you, especially medical decisions, and especially if they're individuals that don't have full information about what's going on. This really falls into the intellectual boundaries because it's about respecting that individuals have the right to their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own opinions, and we as legal adults have the right to make our own choices. So it's really about having a respect and having boundaries around intellectual status and seeing us as intellectual equals who deserve the right to be intellectual creatures and make their own decision. But it kind of expands further and becomes more specific to the chronic illness person. So I feel like it's worth talking about separately. So there's another thing that comes up when you have chronic illness is boundaries around your medical information. And this is something that often comes up in context of whether or not people that we have relationships with believe that our diagnosis is real. And sometimes we feel compelled to prove to them that our diagnosis is valid. So first, let me just say that you owe them nothing. Whatever diagnosis you have is yours, and you owe the people in your life nothing. No justification for that diagnosis. If they choose to believe the validity of your diagnosis or not, that's on them. That's their problem. You are under no obligation to sell them your diagnosis. That's between you and your doctor. It's your doctor's job to investigate your medical problem, and it's their responsibility to sell you on the diagnosis. If they make that diagnosis feel like it fits you and the treatment plan is working for you, then that's it. That's enough. You don't need anyone else's 2 cents on it. You always have the right to say no in giving people your medical information, and it doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter if they're your spouse. Doesn't matter if they're your parent. Doesn't matter if they're your brother or your child. You are not required to give them information about your medical status as long as you're your own legal guardian. How much you disclose should be a matter of how safe and how comfortable you feel in disclosing that information. It shouldn't be something that you feel bullied, pressured, or compelled to do when you disclose your medical information. That should be about you, not them. So absolutely, it is really important to have good boundaries about your medical information. The last place that I think that medical boundaries come up with chronic illness patients is around our medical accommodations. And this kind of falls into informational boundaries and decision making boundaries. We absolutely have every right to ask family members to make accommodations, and then they can either choose to respect that boundary or not. And if they choose not to respect that boundary we've drawn, we have that we say we need to because of medical stuff. It doesn't change any obligation that we have in context of either decision making or informational boundaries. We aren't required to give them more information or explanation of our decision making. What is then required if someone doesn't want to respect a boundary when we say we need this thing because of a medical reason is that we need to make a decision. So an example is that I frequently use is that I'm sensitive to bleach. The fumes of it can make it difficult for me to breathe because it triggers my mast cell stuff. And I will ask people that are around me to not use bleach, and a respectful response is to simply not use bleach. There are some people who are curious and who will ask me, and I'll just give basic information that I have the equivalent of allergic reaction to it, that it makes it difficult for me to breathe. But I'm not even required to give that. That's just what I'm comfortable with. How much information you give to explain the reason for asking them to do something is entirely up to you. Just understand that they are more likely to meet you halfway if you give them at least some kind of basic rationale as to why you want them to change their behaviors. If they refuse and I say and say that they're still going to use this bleach, now I have to decide whether or not I'm going to stay in that environment and risk having a mast cell reaction, or whether I'm going to then say to this person, okay, if you're going to use this bleach, then I'm going to have to leave. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to visit today, but I really can't be around the bleach. And that's the option that I personally take. I would say that if someone's not going to respect something that you say is harmful to you, then you should probably also reconsider that relationship. If they're not interested or concerned when you say something is a safety issue for you or a healthcare issue for you, I would question how valued you are to them if your safety and your medical wellness is not important to you. Important to them. So these are the kinds of things that I feel like come up with chronic illness in context of boundaries. And I think that it's really important that we think about how these boundaries affect us and how we feel about our decision making and our information and how we want to address these issues before we get into the mix of it. Because the reality is that these boundaries are going to be things that we need to draw upon frequently, and that because our chronic illnesses changes a lot over time, these boundaries are also going to be things that will frequently change over time. So it becomes important for us to be very conscientious about thinking about and considering how we feel about the way that our chronic illness affects the way that we socially engage with other people, the way that it necessitates that we draw boundaries in our relationships. Whew, I feel like this one was long winded. So thank you for coming and hanging out with me today and making it all the way to the end. Until we see each other again, stay safe and draw good boundaries. Thank you and bye.